So, of note for intelligence, do your due diligence with that value from yesterday. I just did a probability on a 4-variable random or non-random, non-organic, intentional presentation. So, the first variable tuple. 1. 6'4" Chinese genetic. So it's 0.01% of that population present. 2. Is a mile runner. I'm doing pattern inspection on Kerr, mile runner, concurrently. That's 2. They begin talking specifically at 6:30 p.m. 24 seconds to 55 seconds the conversation initiates. I'm also concurrently on the day studying Mayan pattern 3114/70/7. That product is 6.355. So with these 4 variables simultaneously, and at such volume for a given period of time, where the conversation meanders into Memorial Park Cemetery, graves, etc., I'm also talking about COVID-19, an intentional death exercise of 7 million people, motioned by centrifuge Chinese intelligence. So that's the 5th variable. When added, already with those 4 variables, it's 1 in, let's see the calculate, 1 in 14,836,798,223 against it being random, i.e. intentional, preposterously. And when we add the 5th variable, I haven't even done that yet. We don't need to do that. It's already seated as, is a CCP asset doing an intentional, what they call it, a bait and rub operation. So what would have occurred if I had interacted with that person in a derogatory way? Like is desired to occur. The Wu Mayer or Ted Lieu optic tactic during COVID, commonality, would have been used, of course, very specifically, as his high school senior, and goes, you're attacking me because of DEI diversity thing stuff, then runs a script on you. So it's a do not engage, record probability, facial, capture audio, and then report if you are in public area, because it's like to, as a character attack, this commonality tactic of preposterous pattern inject to pattern recognizer, and then interacts in a derogatory way in public setting, is a commonality tactic. And you see this with Ted Lieu, and very specifically masking the Chinese origin of SARS, MERS, Wuhan. Again, peak hash rate BTC simultaneously at the same exact moment, not a variable moment. The same exact as a mathematical organism, as the first case of COVID out of Wuhan. So AI can inspect these type of weird patterns, and that's impossible, just unto itself. And then 5G architecture also coming out of that. Same city, world scale infrastructure. So 3 things, right? 3 things together, that's impossible, right? So we've talked about that necessarily at massive length in the other talks. NERS, nanite uptake rejection syndrome, graphene, in the no time to die pattern decode yesterday. So we'll go ahead and add, it's 408 right now, you can see in the screen cap, the 5th variable of random presentation. So adding 5 was also talking about logicking COVID-19. 7 million people died. SARS, Wuhan, China. Conversation was regarding Memorial Veterans Cemetery. Graves. Excited about more graves because more business.
How's your food, guys?
Random appearance with this fifth variable and equation
You have like a milestone calendar?
Just like posting that twice a week could help. But also, a higher vote people say different things. 85%.
So with the fifth variable added, it's 1 in 1.97 trillion to not be organic presentation.
All searches.
So the commonality tactic turns into it's a bait and rub tactic where a preposterous pattern is injected to pattern recognition, and then you go, oh, I'm John Nash having an episode, right? But no, what do? I run probability in hindsight after taking field capture data and reporting properly, and it's a 1 in 1.97 trillion chance that he was randomly presented, thus establishing explicitly a CCP asset node in Germantown area. Alright, so we've been doing We Are Not Alone. Part 3 was yesterday. Earth, space, above, below. Proper Masonic protocol is to take care of your house before you go 400 times the speed of light and ruin someone else's house with the goop who attached to your house, right? Basic logic dictates. So, we constantly reconstitute pattern for gray paradigm as we see it, compiling with the understanding of the unified field and pi generalistic pattern through what we just logicked off of No Time to Die already seeded, and those are kind of pseudo patterns that are adjacent centrifuge patterns already known necessarily in the allegory in the film, part of discourse a year and a half old insofar as out of my vector of exutation, so old hat there, just kind of for fun. But so we take the logic continuum that started with a 1 in 1.79 trillion to not be random and intentional presentation 6'4" individual that runs miles and is talking about graves at veteran cemetery and very excited about more business as a desire for interaction, visual optic yesterday, and relogic the entire plurad of pi synthetic genetics of Hispan, Asiatic, Africano, Semite, 3114 BC to 1914, patent fold wall, where previous is a machine pattern in backwash imposed, pseudo-organic pattern, and then a 6 patent frequency for Africano maintained for 112 years with no deviance. And all vectors of behavior paradigm of all of those genetics studied as interlocking and autonomous as a data organism, autonomous from all of their genetics on Earth, but across the divide of 4 genetics. establishing absolute centrifuge with no extraneous bad logic attached in the motion, from inputting the unified field to confuse the AI or whatever, for a general fluid dynamic manifold harmonic equation to describe the data organism across the divide of those four genetics. So then we look at local. We start with, what is the probability of a building named Nailology having a lowercase I, right 5 feet away from a 5G tower, and New Asia in line of sight, and your DMV turning into a karate center, and then the local kiosk non-functional, and then the closest functioning DMV right next to dim sum Chinese food restaurant. Coming out of the COVID logic, which is BTC highest hash rate occurring simultaneously and exactly surgically as the first case of COVID occurs. 5G rolling out of the same municipality, Wuhan, out of all other cities in the world, a full-scale infrastructure upgrade. That's because COVID is SARS and NERS, nanite uptake rejection syndrome. 5G, Hawaii, graphene manufacturers. The graphene nanite elaborating passive conditioning through AI feed sorts, through Pavlovian stimulus directly at dopaminergic receptor sites. Anti-malarials necessarily working just like for a malarial parasite, the graphene nanite responding to those. That's why those work for not a virus. L-cysteine logic as a concomitant with anti-inflammatory corticosteroid as a full treatment protocol that would have been a 68% death reduction, and on the NIH website any number of times, so in known arsenal, but ignored, etc. And so then the Germantown network attached to the Memphis larger network, my father, Fred Smith, Fisher, the complex here, Interdomain, Jerry Hubbard, Bruce Meisterman. So Jerry Hubbard, First Tennessee, former, now New Horizons, surgically before the first case of COVID changes. And he dumps his whole ledger and transmutes the whole ledger before this predictive event going to occur. Bruce Meisterman necessarily attached to Carla Meisterman now, running a church that only has 11 members but is 40,000 square feet. And so he comes from, it was a Delaware University funded by Wexner. Pennsylvania inspected. My grandfather went to Penn State, I believe, and Wexner there. We studied the shooter of attempt on Trump's life, having come out of there, and 2 psychologists for parents that study at a Pennsylvania university that's funded by Wexner. Wexner equals Borla equals Epstein equals Mossad. 322 Gray Lodge equals Clinton, Bush, Prism, Metasystems. Suppresses my voice at the market of full curative treatment protocol. Corticosteroid plus anti-inflammatory plus allicin equals L-cysteine. A full eradicative allicin is much more effective than isolate L-cysteine, so the number of 68% for that complex entourage's assembly is low. It's probably like 85% effective. As it goes straight to the respiratory system, the cannabis and the chewed raw garlic, it's not mass producible garlic and cannabis, so isn't a foreseeable, mass producible with Defense Production Act treatment protocol, but the complex is an arsenal. L-cysteine isolate, rapidly able to be manufactured with Defense Production Act, nominal, atypical in any ER, anti-inflammatory or corticosteroid available, and the anti-inflammatory necessarily commonality used regardless of the mandate of vaccine or Paxlovid, a 1.5 year wait. So logic is the death toll 68% reduction if after my post in July of 2020 regarding the full spectrum treatment protocol, was allowed to proliferate insofar as an organic communication system and wasn't suppressed. As there's no other high rotating voices that mention a full spectrum treatment protocol within the intradomain of the window of the outset of the virus, I'm an isolated incident. In my pattern background to my father, Bell Labs, NSA, CIA, Wilson J. West, Army Corps of Engineers, Penn State, Post Office. Father worked for Fred Smith for 30 years. Fred Smith equals Yale, Gray Lodge, etc., etc., etc. So we do to death the Germantown, Memphis network in and out of COVID and back and forth through history, through the plurad of genetics and into this back and forth. And then we logic legal and proximity cause. I can't remember the name or whatever. Getting around that and having to establish a precedent of an intentionality in voice suppression to motion intentionally a death exercise. BTC, formulated out of NSA code base, of course, is a joint operation between 322 CIA, NSA, and CCP intelligence. The Bitcoin miners leave predictively early 2017, 4474 bill, Texas crypto legislature, 444/7 is 63 non-terminus, the 63rd hexagram, completion, right? And then they exit as predictively as a predictive ban is going to occur. Nothing of scale occurs in China without agreement from the Chinese government or just being industriously a Chinese operation, such as their Bitcoin mining. So that sets up a capital catcher for the inflation event and capital exodus, predictive at a huge monetary print, such as 6 or 4.84 billion trillion, sorry, did the Dr. Evil thing there, for the event. And that almost same amount is like to be reallocated by Congress prior to 2020 death exercise of the Social Security slush fund. And 100% of the new millionaires, that's a new knock list, produced by the 4 banks that received that 4.84 trillion, liquidity dump in 2020, 100% of new millionaires. So that's not random. So foreknowledge, an interoperable community, seated and ready to milk the money print at those 4 banks in question. That's a different session. You'll have to see what 4 banks and that logic necessarily. So we logic Fisher here locally trains under Ray, FBI, what has a modulant intent vector of the 282 FBI training program. What you can see very obviously in House Intelligence Committee watching, anyone can watch those. The intelligence community during Biden admin changed from attacking external state actors, with proactive interest, to attacking the endogenous sovereign demographic of the United States using DEI logic to justify that. Southern Poverty Law Center equals the KKK, right? So having to fund their own, boogeymen as well. And so trained on attack your own people, FBI manual, that manual foundation isn't necessarily nefarious, going back to Hoover, but the modulant variant is, that trains persons to see white males as default, terrorists, because are maintaining the sovereignty of the United States, because are the majority demographic and not poking another demographic with pointy sticks necessarily, unless they're being poked with pointy sticks. And so we see then later in logic that, of course, the KKK equals the 322 Gray Lodge. And before 1914, mathematically, at all vectors, the Africano genetic does not exist in the United States. So in mathematical inspection at the patent registry and all of their facets of behavior paradigm is a pseudo-organic mechanical backwash on lay pattern, like a machine intelligence would lay on, and after 1914, a locked and for 112 years straight concurrent homogeneous pattern. So in basic mathematical inspection, that organism of mathematical data consideration does not exist before 1914. And so the narrative requires a boogeyman to be created where none exists. And so the counterparty, controlling the counter argument has to be created and monetized. Paid for. Southern Poverty Law Center equals the KKK. That's why I'm posting under that post with Continuum. And not in this session, but Stuart Lewis Nunn and the nuns generalistically, KKK attached to some facet of my family, never slave owners. 333 medical, him the head of, treated LBJ, right? He's a cardiologist for LBJ, Stuart Lewis. But never slave owners, but somehow, and not really racist in voting Democrat. How does that work? Huh. And then you see the Democrat with the Nazi tattoo. Yeah? So it has to create their own boogeymen that don't exist. Exactly. And so, we inspect Memphis network massively, going in and out of that, and necessarily the Pennsylvania shooter denoted as a non-organic probability, and all facets of this probability seated as, beyond random, starting with the 6'4" Chinese man. That's, it's a optic sort of pattern overload for interaction that I transmute into comically the most preposterous pattern inspection of history ever, centrifuge. There's really no bad pattern in the continuance and no code walls that I hit because I know all the special keywords to not say and to say to keep it continuity motioning through filter. So then we logic, a personal historical thing, the probability of that we established Bruce Meisterman, Jerry Hubbard married to Carla Meisterman prior to Bruce Meisterman living right next door to my friend used to play soccer with, Christian Reeser, over there somewhere in Germantown. Meet this person, love interest, first year of college, who will remain nameless, see the feed, but the probability of that meeting being random. So in hindsight, inspection would be as soon as romantic affinity was seated, she's a honeypot, gaslighting stereotypical of a trauma-based mind control motion, this week we're together and this week we're not, this week we're together, this week just like a roller coaster on purpose, preposterous. And in the probability of her meeting me being, impossibly non-organic, somebody that was right next to a close friend at a major college so far away, and then meeting each other and then falling in love, air quotes, very preposterous. Given the current forward pattern seated in network, since hindsight probability analysis, throwing out the potentiality of a time machine. Why? Because predictive analysis on a controlled data set, we pinpoint my father, worked for Bell Labs, NSA, always on and on about working on AI, even though he's not supposed to be blabbing his mouth like that he's doing that since the 1980s. So running predictive analysis on a controlled set such as the US population, especially interdomain of a house that's building AI for data analysis of this, pinpoints probabilistic high dissident node vectors such as myself that can motion things like a full curative treatment protocol during COVID, or see the entire gray paradigm network internationally casually, put them all on a list and make them do what I want them to do, which is what is occurring right now. That's very important. I didn't bring in the Earth as seen from space proxy for returned antediluvian minor homeworld upper Fermi filter sieves sitting in phased anti-de-Sitter with time dilative surgical harmonic action at a distance EM laser to genetic signature or object. I didn't say that in this segment, but that's necessarily adjacently true, as well as the data lord status that is occur. And very clearly the case at the moment. So I guess this this open face, so make sure Cash and Director to do your due diligence to roto-root the Germantown area. It's like I started this. It's a pet peeve, necessarily below my interest grade, but isn't. Like I said at the beginning, we clean our house first so we don't track mud into the universe. And this is my house. I was kicked out of it in 2020, and I would be moving back in there at some point through pain of law. After you see the legal motion in the feed in settlement, I'll be taking everything they own. Everything my grandmother owns and everything my father owns. Because they're responsible, probabilistically, 1 to, 14.8 million against, and the probability is much higher when we calculate all the probability after that of their actions to voice suppression op me under the guise of an interfamilial incident being probabilistically impossible to not be intentionally that. Lawrence J. Lorenzi from Birch Porter Johnson used as an ex-prosecutor of a high rotating nature for an eviction case. Within 1 month after I post on Facebook a full spectrum curative treatment protocol for COVID. Given the nature and background of my father, the preposterosity of the motion and time fashion, it's beyond inspection. And so the proximity sort of necessity of establishing a precedent forward is, semantical at best. That sort of having to draw correlation between intentionality to motion, death, through the voice suppression is, he comes out of Prism data systems. I said that into Prism and it was suppressed. It's still sitting as a pin post with no likes on it, even though I have 3,900 friends on Facebook. No likes. Smoking gun pinned. Full spectrum treatment protocol curative. Much more elaborately than 68% curative. On the NIH website, all this. So the basic logic dictates Fauci, etc., scans own website data. Oh, we can just use $5 L-cysteine. Anti-inflammatory, corticosteroid, no. Borla, Pfizer, Mossad, Epstein, 322 Gray Lodge equals CCP. And that's why not. Because it's intentional. BTC, methodical, intentional. Contagion 2011, methodical, intentional, not an accident. Intentional death exercise. So them locally complicit in that, as if it was an organic media's, and my voice was heard. Well, you would have heard about a curative protocol. It would be used instead of waiting for another one that doesn't fucking work. Basic logic dictates. So that semantical connectivity of causality and voice suppression of curative motion to effect of death fallout is, null necessarily in needing to argue it, as its basic logic is interconnected. So everyone that experienced basic cognitive dissonance during COVID felt the voice suppression and commonality of scripted response from 322 NSA, low-hanging fruit. There's 64,000 of them in the United States on the interweb, a scripted response against your basic cognitive dissonance against surgical mask on faceplace, right? That necessarily is made with graphene and any number of other things that were stupid and preposterous. So we all experienced that, not just old Scotty. Anyways, So that's at length describing the logic session. Today was, kind of word salad comically. We've already done all of this logic necessarily, but not in a centrifuge with no tangent refracted bad logic in the continuum. It's just surgical because I've been through it so many times. So surgical to exacting legal motion, there's no bad language in that. I can literally just print that off and serve it. So now see the session.